welcome everybody to the Forging Effective Intermediaries session. So why intermediaries? I mean, why is this an important part to what we're doing? And I think all of you, most of you are familiar with the Pathways report, and we've heard a lot today about bringing together stakeholders across sectors, bringing together government and business and the civil sector, nonprofit and philanthropy together, working cross-sector. That's come up numerous times. And we all know that that's what needs to happen. Now, on the other hand, we find ourselves in a situation where the sectors aren't terrifically well accustomed to speaking with each other. In fact, sometimes it can sound a little bit like the Tower of Babel, when government is speaking with business, is speaking with education, is speaking with nonprofit, is speaking with philanthropy. So we have that one challenge. We have other challenges. You can pick almost any aspect of this issue that we're here to discuss: pathways to prosperity, college to career, cradle to career. Pick any aspect of this, and you'll find many different players, again, cross-sector, but even within sector, different nonprofits that are supporting career development, et cetera. You'll find many different players in the same sector who are measuring themselves differently. You will find that there is not clear communication in terms of different parties that are involved in this effort. All of this points to the fact that if we want to achieve cross-sector alignment and coordination around pathways to prosperity, that we need to think about an organization or a set of individuals who are actually helping that happen. And that's where the concept of an intermediary comes in. Now, to explore this topic, we have a great panel for you today. We have Jeff Mays, who is president of the Illinois Business Roundtable. And in Jeff's capacity, he, as the president of the Illinois Business Roundtable, he has been a champion and a guiding light to the Illinois Learning Exchanges. You'll hear more about these over the course of this afternoon. But essentially, Illinois Learning Exchanges are a public-private partnership between state government and business. They're designed to coordinate investments and programs that connect students and careers. And importantly, they focus on career pathways around specific industry clusters in technology and manufacturing. Jeff Edmondson is the managing director of the Strive Network. The Strive Network at this point is really a set of communities around the country, numbering well over 100 at this point, that have committed themselves to achieving progress for every child from cradle to career. This was, Jeff initiated this work, was part of a group that initiated this work in Cincinnati back in, 2006? And made terrific progress there in Cincinnati. And Jeff was actually the leader of the intermediary. I think you were probably were you the first leader? Yeah. For a number of years. And Jeff has moved on from being an intermediary around one specific community or working in one specific community to actually leading and guiding the efforts of the Strive Network, which, as I said, is over 100 communities at this point, really operating and functioning in this framework of cradle-to-career education reform. And Jeff, at this point, is actually guiding and providing sort of structure and framing and inspiration and all sorts of things that he'll talk about to communities around the country, and is really sort of one of the leading lights when it comes to thinking about intermediaries and the role that they play in these sorts of efforts. And finally, we have Amy Loyd. Amy is the director of Pathways to the Prosperity Network. She's also with JFF. And Amy is providing guidance to states and communities around the country, and in that capacity has really a great bird's eye view on a lot of different efforts, as well as the intermediaries that are supporting those efforts. So, and we also, Paul Grogan, who is the CEO of the Boston Foundation, was supposed to be here with us today. Paul has a lot of experience in this area, and unfortunately he had to cancel. But we've got three terrific panelists, and let's get right into it. Our structure for this afternoon is I'm going to share with you a bit of thinking from my firm, FSG, and our work around how large-scale, cross-sector collaborative change takes place. And we'll use that as a bit of a backdrop to get into a conversation with Jeff and Amy. And we'll do a little bit of back and forth here. We'll kick it out to the audience. And then, of course, we want to end this session with what are the calls to action specifically around the role that intermediaries can play in pathways to prosperity. So my firm, FSG, is a nonprofit strategy consulting firm. And we work across really all sectors of the social sector. Poverty reduction, we work in community development, we work in education reform, environment, sustainability, et cetera. And a number of years back, we got together as a senior group of folks within our firm and asked ourselves the question, how is society going to achieve more positive and consistent and accelerated progress at scale? And that led us to the notion that really is becoming pretty well accepted, although not terrifically well practiced yet across the United States, that we need more cross-sector coordination and alignment. And we went out to study really, what it was that resulted, what were sort of the conditions that resulted in positive and consistent progress at scale, and developed this, very specific framework around thinking about what we called collective impact. And when we initially went out and looked at efforts across the United States and really around the world, and what we were looking for was efforts not just in education, not just in workforce development, but across the entire social sector that had achieved positive and consistent progress at scale, and were really accelerating efforts in their communities. And there weren't a lot of efforts that we could find that had done that, but those that we identified had five things in common. The first was that you had a set of players across sector that came together to develop a common agenda, which they agreed jointly to pursue and to hold each other accountable for. So the first condition was a common agenda. The second condition was that players who were involved in the efforts came together and said, okay, we need to take an approach where we're sharing our approach to measurement, where we come up with a limited number of indicators that we are going to measure our success by, and we're all going to use those, and we're going to measure those both at a community or a population level, and we ought to be able to bring them down to an individual organization level and understand how individual organizations are actually contributing to what we as a community have decided we want to do. So common agenda and shared measurement. The third condition that we found was that organizations, again, cross-sector, but also within individual sectors, were working in a mutually reinforcing way. So they had an understanding of the differentiated activities that they were delivering against, and that rather than sort of working at odds from each other, they were actually working in a mutually reinforcing way, coordinating efforts. The fourth condition we found was continuous communication. And this is one that I think the more I do this work, the more that I really appreciate how absolutely critical this work this is to thinking about collective impact. We find that a lot of collaborative efforts, organizations, individuals, communicate on a periodic basis. We find that those efforts that are achieving positive and consistent progress at scale, we have, in many instances, very senior people from the organizations that are involved communicating on, an almost weekly basis with each other. Really unheard of in the world that we inhabit today, which is one that we refer to as making progress in certain areas, but in a world of isolated impact. And the last thing we found was that for efforts that were making positive and consistent progress at scale, there was a need to have what we called backbone support, an organization or a set of individuals whose sole purpose was the alignment and coordination of all the organizations and individuals working in the effort. Our perspective, although we can't prove it empirically, is that this is probably the #1 reason why cross-sector collaboration fails. That insufficient attention and insufficient resources were put towards the existence of a backbone support organization. So when we think about the role that intermediaries play, I'd like you to think about them as backbones. How many human bodies can function without a backbone? How many cross-sector efforts devoted to pathways to prosperity can function without a backbone? We can call them intermediaries, we can call them backbones. Backbones sounds a lot more fun to me. I don't know about you. Now, we've spent a lot of time looking at the notion of backbone organizations and have found that they do have a number of things in common, and this is really irregardless of the community that they're in, regardless of whether or not they're a backbone at a community level, a state level, or a regional level, and regardless of really what issue they're focused on. Typically, these backbone organizations have a high level of credibility within the community. They serve as neutral conveners. They have dedicated staff. This is somebody's job. They're able to build relationships. That's a key aspect to this. They focus people's attention to create urgency. They frame the issues. They think about how we actually measure progress across the effort, not just at an individual organization level. And they ensure coordination and accountability. And quite often, most often, they're most effective when they're really operating behind the scenes. Some of you are familiar with the concept of servant leadership. This is leadership in its purest form, but it is often leading from behind. That's what we find with these organizations. We actually spent the better part of last year working with a number of organizations in Jeff Edmondson's hometown of Cincinnati. We actually worked with backbone organizations across a wide variety of sectors, including workforce development and education, but also economic development, early childhood, and community development. And we tried to dissect and work with these organizations to find out, what was really key, what were the key activities that really helped them be successful. And they were these 6 activities. The first was that they were supporting and guiding vision and strategy. By that I mean that they weren't necessarily the ones who were out there in front saying, this is where we need to go, but somebody needed to facilitate that development of the common agenda, bringing everybody together, understanding what does success look like? Can we get on the same page with that? What are key indicators of success? That process needed to be facilitated, and typically that was a key role that backbone organizations were playing. The second was, and perhaps the area where there's the most diversity of tasks, is that they supported aligned activities. And this was a wide variety of things, from coordinating and facilitating communication to convening partners to catalyzing and incubating new organizations if those were needed, to creating paths for even more organizations to be and individuals to be involved in the effort. A wide variety of things around supporting aligned activities. The third was establishing shared measurement practices. Now, I think for most of the people in this room, it wouldn't be a surprise, and it's probably not novel for us to say that we need to get on the same page with common indicators. I think perhaps what's a little bit more surprising, and what these backbone organizations often spend a lot of time doing, is helping organizations measure their own performance and measure their performance in a way that they have a sense of how it's contributing to the greater whole. So it's not just saying, okay, what are the indicators of success, but it's really working with organizations for them to help organizations understand how they're measuring their own success, and to help organizations that are working together to look at the data together and to say, what does the data mean? To learn from the data. So it's not just shared measurement, but shared measurement practices. The fourth was building public will. I mean, I think we had an extraordinary set of speakers this morning that I think could get this group pretty razzed and excited about the need that we have in front of us here. Much, much more challenging to build the will among the general public. And this is a role that the more sophisticated backbones that we've seen can also play. And the fifth is advancing policy. You know, we think about sort of most organizations at this point, most sophisticated organizations who are involved in career pathways understand the importance of policy. What still, again, isn't often done is getting alignment of policy so that you get all the organizations who are focused on this in your community speaking with one voice, aligning policy. And the last is mobilizing funding. And I would actually tell you that, you know, we've revised this to be mobilizing resources. It's really more than just helping direct funding to the effort, but really how do you mobilize, particularly in the case of the company contributions, the full resources and assets of the community to actually, you know, bring greater resources to the effort. So we've seen these 6 activities really be core to the activities of really any effective backbone. We've found, as we've looked at this, you know, backbones across the country, that you will find them at various different stages of development, and that it would be pretty remarkable if the backbone were actually, you know, firing on all cylinders and delivering against all 6 of these activities. This is a lot. And you'll also find that most of these organizations, you look at everything that's up there and you say, my goodness, this is probably enough work for 100 people, maybe more. Most of these organizations are 2, 3, 4, maybe up to 8 people doing a lot, coordinating the efforts of literally, in many instances, hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals to do this work well. The other interesting thing that we've found is that really all types of organizations are playing this role. It's not necessarily you know, an existing nonprofit. Sometimes a new nonprofit needs to be developed. Sometimes you can actually, this role can be performed within government. Sometimes it's actually shared across multiple organizations. There are different trade-offs, pluses and minuses to each of these. I'll tell you that the bottom line is that your community context really trumps everything else. And really understanding what's the best organization to play this role at either a community, a regional, or a state level is really going to be contingent on your context. It's fascinating to us that really we have all different types of organizations that are playing this backbone, this intermediary role. To me, it's one of the coolest and most interesting new types of organizations in the social sector. It is one that, from my standpoint, has the biggest opportunity, one of the biggest opportunities to deliver leveraged scale progress. But it really is based on not the work that it does, but aligning and coordinating the efforts of other people that are doing this work, of other organizations that are doing this work. Nonetheless, an absolutely critical role. So with that as a bit of a backdrop, let's turn to our panelists. And Jeff Mays, let me start with you. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the Illinois Learning Exchanges, the public-private partnership between state government and business. And would love to hear a little bit of, you know, how did that come into existence? How did you guys sort of determine the need for that? And then how did you determine and how are you thinking about the role of intermediaries or backbone organizations in the Illinois Learning Exchange?
Okay. First of all, welcome. This is the end of the day, and you guys have shown a great deal of stamina, and we're all going to make this as an enjoyable experience for each of you, so that you can all go home and say, we really got something out of this piece of this seminar. That's our goal here, okay? The Illinois Business Roundtable has been around since 1989, and we've been doing education. and doing education for a long, long time. Like many of our counterpart organizations and our national counterpart organization, we focused initially on standards, assessments, accountability, blah, blah, blah. And that was a good thing to do, and we've got them in place, and they gave us a good structure from which we could go forward. Fact of the matter is, though, in Illinois, we're not changing a whole lot. We know what the standards are, but we've messed with the assessments so we can look better at some points, and we've done some other things, really some fits and starts. And in 2006, our members came to us and they said, you know, the pipeline, the education pipeline is pretty bad, but our workforce pipeline is going to be even worse. So we commissioned a study through Northern Illinois University to look at the demographics of our workforce, the kinds of skills that we have, the gaps that are there, and what are we going to do about it. And like every other state probably, you know, up until 2015, our workforce supply is pretty flat, and our education supply going into it is pretty flat. But about 2015, just by virtue of the demographics in Illinois, a lot of folks my age and around Bullock's age are going to start getting out of the workforce, leaving a gap both in numbers as well as in skills. And what are we going to do about that? 2008, we started some discussions with Bill Simons. And a number of our other early partners from the State Board of Education were there when we decided we were going to have to do something about that. And how are we going to structure this different than job training partnership, different than education to career, school to work, youth apprenticeship, blah, 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 blah. I mean, there's been a lot of those fits and starts. How are we going to do something that's going to last, that'll have the impact or the potential for impact to change? And that's kind of how we got into this thing. There are, you know, when you look at the title of this seminar, Forging Effective Intermediaries, I mean, that sounds kind of boring. It's forging effective intermediaries to do something. And that's what I think this group is all about, this seminar is all about. It's how do we take what we, you know, the whys that we got out over there in those plenary sessions and the moral cause, and how do we translate it into effective action back home? How do we do something in Chicago? How do we do something in Aurora? How do we do something in Rockford? How do we make this work across our state? Because I got to tell you, it's not about lack of resources. You heard Rick Stevens, my chairman, say that this morning. There's plenty of resources in this system. Lots and lots and lots of them. It's about alignment. And we know the need, the skills gaps, the demographics. We've got lots of visions and lots of initiatives. We got NAF and Jobs for the Future and JAG and High Schools at Work and Project Lead the Way, and you just go on and on. And we've got lots of money. I mean, you look at the foundations in my membership that are doing education, and it's a lot of money. So it's a question, in our opinion, of alignment. And that's what we set out to do. And it's not just aligning our own collective will, our own collective industry cluster, it's aligning the public sector behind this stuff too. We started, and we didn't pass a piece of legislation in Illinois because we didn't think we needed to, and we didn't. Jonathan Furf, former guy with the State Board of Education, General Counsel, put together a Race to the Top application, and for the career part, for the extra credit piece of that application, this was a piece of it. When we didn't get funded in 1 and 2, you know, we kept everybody meeting. We were having 1,000 people show up at the Museum of Science and Industry saying, we have to do this whether we get funding or not. It may take us a little longer, but this is going to change how we do what we do in Illinois. And we just committed to do it. We got a little bit of money with round 3, and that's basically gave us a critical mass to move forward. Well, so, bottom line, we were able to identify the clusters in Illinois that we feel are absolutely critical to our future growth. They've been critical to our past growth, and we better get on it if we're going to keep growing. We were able to align all of the state agencies by an intergovernmental agreement. So the State Board of Education, the Community College Board, the Board of Higher Education, the Student Assistance Commission, The Department of Economic Opportunity, which does economic development, the Department of Employment Security, which does workforce training, they all said, we're in this together. We're going to align our resources as you align yours. So when we had that commitment, we felt we could go forward in good faith and see if we could put these dollars to good use. We got $2.3 million out of a race to the top thing. That's nothing for what we're trying to do. But we told them if they give us that, we'll do the best we could to match it. And in a period of about 8 weeks, we matched it and then quadrupled it. We had we got 2.3. We had 8.5 million in identified match already, and it's probably way beyond that since these exchanges have been up and running. But the bottom line is, you know, the Manufacturers Association said we own the manufacturing exchange, and we're going to get out there and we're going to talk about credentials and apprenticeships and work-based learning and mentors and getting those teachers out in our work site. We own that. Same with CompTIA, stepping up for the IT exchange. Same with Mark Harris and the Illinois Science Technology Coalition. Those are the folks that are driving this. It's not the Roundtable. You know, we're trying to keep them all together as best we can. But if there's going to be impact, it's going to be because Jim Nelson and the manufacturers know this guy in Quincy, Illinois, that has a problem getting welders for his shop floor, and we're going to be figuring out a way to get Quincy High School and John Wood Community College working together to help address that problem. And by the way, give them a career without a whole lot of debt. So the bottom line is, we're still a work in progress. We've got 35 school districts, including Chicago, Peoria, Bloomington, Normal, you know, not small school districts. We've got 35 school districts that we've focused on directly through the Race to the Top effort. We're working with just Jobs for the Future and Aurora and Rockford in doing some special projects in their areas. And there's going to be schools like the little district that I'm a school board member at, Quincy, Illinois. It's going to be piling on, asking Jim Nelson to do more for us. That's how we're planning to work. When we talk about sustainability, if these things don't add any value, and there's 9 of them, it's on the slide somewhere, but the bottom line is, you can pull up our website, ilpathways.com, and if these things don't add value, you know, they're not going to be sustained. My sense is they are industry-driven. They are partnerships of the willing. We're not going to any school district and say, do this. We're saying, you want to do something along these lines, this is a framework that we would be able to help you in. So my sense is, if it's not sustainable in the out years, it's because the exchange hasn't added any value, and we'll redo that one. But I've taken up enough time for my piece. I'll look forward to hearing from the audience and seeing what kind of questions they might have. But we're the ones that are getting our hands dirty. We're the intermediaries to make this work. Okay?
Great, thanks, Jeff. Well, you bring up this issue of the fact that these efforts, and specifically these organizations, intermediaries, backbone organizations, if they don't add value, they're probably not going to be around in 4 or 5 years. And Jeff Edmondson, you've worked as leader in a backbone organization in Cincinnati, and really have achieved some amazing results in cradle to career education in Cincinnati. Would love to hear you talk a little bit about those. But given that you're further down the line in maturity and really understanding these backbone organizations, we'd love to hear you talk a little bit, specifically about the role of the intermediary, even, to what extent, how do you think even about sort of staffing these organizations? What sort of skills are required?
Great. We'll definitely do that. It's wonderful to have some time with you all today. I'll definitely get into those questions. I think, quite frankly, John, based on the study of the work that's going on in Cincinnati and the slide you shared here, has really captured beautifully sort of what are the key functions of the backbone. I did have the pleasure of being the founding director of the Strive Partnership in Cincinnati. So I thought what would probably be most useful is for me to share a little 5 stories about what gave me gray hair. Quite frankly, and I do have gray hair. My wife tells me all the time. And I'm betting that it's very consistent with your experience, but I do think that these stories will highlight what the role of the intermediary is, but also what it requires in order for an intermediary to be effective. So first off, how many of you have read the article on collective impact that John was pulling a lot of this from? Okay, about half. It's a great article. Strongly recommend everybody checking it out. You can learn a lot about the details of the Strive partnership in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky from that. I am the first to say that having lived it, starting really as early as 2004 and trying to pull the partners together, that is a very sanitized version of reality. It almost makes it sound like people, we just kind of got together in Cincinnati and all of a sudden everybody agreed. And there was a kumbaya circle that happened, and now everybody's running forward together. But the bottom line is that we're about to release the 5th report card tomorrow in Cincinnati on 8 outcomes from cradle to career. Kindergarten readiness, 3rd grade reading, 8th grade math, high school graduation, college readiness, entrance, retention, completion are the outcomes that we really care about. And at this point, 89% of the outcomes across 3 communities and multiple systems are trending in the right direction consistently over time. And that's pretty phenomenal in many ways, but it certainly isn't just because of the partnerships development. I think it's because of a broader ownership on the part of a community around this concept of collective impact. And so I put on all the tables a one-pager front and back that just has a few slides. We're going to test if you all could actually do some collective impact together by whether or not you're able to share these pieces of paper, because I did not bring enough for everybody. But I would say the first thing that is really critical about having an effective intermediary is about building the case for what the value is, right? Why does it need to exist? And the bottom slide on the first page kind of gets to that, of sort of what is, as we see it, the key difference between traditional collaboration and this idea, this profound idea that John and Mark outlined of collective impact. And the first one is that if you really want to do this collective impact work well, you are not coming together around an RFP or a program. You're coming together around an outcome, right? Or hopefully multiple outcomes within a given sector. And that is just absolutely fundamentally critical. And it's a huge difference, because if people are coming together around a program, one, you've already assumed you know the solution, right? And number 2, you're probably coming together around money, right? Everybody's trying to get a piece of the pie. And our take is that in order to be an effective intermediary, and it gets back to something, Jeff, you said, you have to come together around what is the dial that you want to move, because that's going to become your true north. And I'll talk more about that in a second. The second is consistent with something that John said. You're not using data anymore just to prove things. You're using data to improve things, right? And the culture, whether it's in career pathways or down to early childhood education, is that data is used as a stick, not, as Amy Gadara of the Data Quality Campaign would say, as a flashlight, right? It's brilliant. Using data to highlight what's working rather than beating people upside the head. That's the movement from proving to improving. Next is that rather than collaboration is something you do, I don't know, I worked at a high school in DC, and we had a staff meeting once a month, and the principal would always announce a new collaboration, or 7 or 8 that had emerged, right? And everybody would immediately dive under the table, because it meant that there was going to be one more thing added to your plate if you got volunteered for it, right? And this idea of collective impact should be that you're going to actually get data as a result of having this intermediary. You're going to get data on a regular basis to do what you do every single day better, right? That's a powerful concept, because it's hard in the social sector to take the time to look at data and use it effectively, and that's what this work should actually give you. And then the last piece is that you can stop just advocating for ideas. I like career pathways, right? And start having the data to say, I know career pathways work. We get this many more people into higher ed. They stick around. They graduate. They get into careers if we build these career pathways. When you have the data at hand, you're not advocating for a good idea. You're saying this is what really gets results for the students that we serve, right? So the first thing I would just say from this slide is hopefully it can give you a way to say this is why having an intermediary would be so critical. Does that make sense, everybody? So the next piece I want to do is just give 5 quick stories on just lessons on what we think made the intermediary so successful in Cincinnati, and what we're seeing around the country in places like Milwaukee and others are really empowering intermediaries to be successful. The first is this idea of servant leadership, right? As John mentioned, the irony is that John's article on collective impact, as awesome as it was, it actually made our job in Cincinnati harder, right? Because it lifted up Strive front and center as the mover and shaker. When in honesty, what you really want to do is lift up all the partners all the time, right? So quite frankly, it was hard for me to play the intermediary leadership role after some time because it seemed it was a little bit too much about Jeff. So the new executive director, I handed off the local work. Greg Landsman is his name. He's much smarter than me. You'll be hearing a ton about him soon. He never goes to an interview with the press or never goes to a big meeting alone. He always brings partners with him, always. He will cancel a meeting rather than go alone if he knows that it's going to lead to some sort of attention. And that's critical. So I think the number one thing is truly taking into account the fact that you do have to be a servant leader to get this done, and always lift up your partners. Always. Every single chance you get. The next would be aligning around outcomes. Really, really purposefully. And a good story here is that, I think it's a good story, so you'll have to tell me later. You can come up and tell me if it was good or bad. John Pepper, who is the chairman and CEO, the former chairman and CEO of Procter & Gamble, that small little company based in Cincinnati. He came up to me after one of our leadership meetings of the partnership, and he said, Jeff, I just have to tell you that you are a great guy, I think, but your meetings are incredibly boring, right? They are just the worst most of the time. Said the only time that they're interesting is when you start talking about data, right? And he said, I can tell if people are interested because they're all leaning forward. They're all leaning forward, and that's how I tell whether or not people are interested. And right now, most of you all are leaning backwards, so I'm a little upset. But we're just going to keep going anyway. But the point being is that if you let data be the translator, right, the intermediary is going to gain traction, right? And so every meeting now, every single meeting of the partnership starts with a vision, and second, the outcomes, and any data that we have on whether or not we're making progress. And the topic is why we are making progress. Why? An analysis of the data. And if we're not making progress, why we're not making progress, right? So aligning behind outcomes. And one person in our community, he was a very religious man, and he was an executive on loan from us from Procter & Gamble. And he was a very religious man. And he came up and he said, this is truly the Tower of Babel, and the only translator we have is data. So just keep using it. Don't ever stop talking about it. Because when we do, we fall by the wayside. Another story is political cover. An intermediary cannot be successful unless there is a group of 5, 6, or 7 cross-sector partners, CEO-level partners, who are willing to go to bat for the work of the intermediary. Right? So we have the presidents of the universities, the superintendents, the heads of businesses, the heads of nonprofits and civic organizations. If they are not willing to give you political cover, you're in big trouble. So getting back to a previous story, when I said Greg never goes to meetings alone, he doesn't just bring them to opportunities when there's going to be press. When there's a tough meeting that needs to be had where somebody's about to say, you know what, things aren't going so well, don't go alone, right? Bring those champions, those leaders who will give you the political cover to say, you know what, we looked at the data and this isn't making so much progress. And that doesn't mean we it's a bad thing and we're throwing you under the bus, but we do need to think about how we could do things differently, right? Yeah.
Going back to your previous point about data, we're in the earlier stages of this work out in Sonoma County, California, and we have those indicators that we're all looking at community-wide, and I think we run up against how much of that can we take credit for at this stage in the process, and we don't want to oversell what we've done thus far. So how do we go forward and say, look at all this great data, and have people almost lose credibility by saying you're taking credit for that? I mean, so where do you walk that fine line?
Honestly, we did a terrible job walking that fine line for a very long time. So so that the stories I'm telling you, and then I'm going to hand it off to Amy because I'm sure she has beautiful stories on that as well. I could just keep going on these stories because this is practically like therapy for me, and it is awesome. It really feels good to just let it all out up here. No, in all seriousness on that, one of our second report card that we put out, we started to see a few things go in the right direction. And without even knowing it, whenever there was a positive thing, myself or the chair stood up and talked about it. Whenever there's a negative thing, we let somebody else talk about it. Totally didn't mean to do it at all, right? But I would honestly say that when you're starting to see those positive things go in the right direction, it goes back to exactly what John said. Be behind the scenes. Be very quiet, right? And let them talk about you. So if it's the school district that's starting to see some things go in the right direction, let the superintendent talk about it, but make sure he or she says, and by the way, this wouldn't be possible without the intermediary that's been feeding us the data that we need in order to succeed. But that's all you really need in order to validate your existence. And we really struggled with that up front, quite frankly, because we thought we needed to get up and pound our chest, when really our partners needed to pound their chests for us. Does that make sense? So I have 2 more stories. We can get to them later, but I think Amy would be wonderful at passing along her knowledge as well, and then we can get into some questions.
Let me tee you up with a question.
All right.
I think it's interesting, you know, we heard from the 2 Jeffs, Jeff Mays in terms of a statewide exchange, and then Jeff Edmondson took us down to the community level. And what's fascinating as these cross-sector efforts get going is that there is alignment that has to occur at a lot of different levels. And Amy, you have, in your role as directors of Pathways to Prosperity and working with JFF, you have kind of a bird's eye view, almost a national view. And I'd be curious your perspectives about how do we think about that sort of, you know, layered way of thinking about alignment where it's maybe not just one organization but multiple organizations, and just how do you think about that? What have you seen?
Wow, being an intermediary is difficult, messy work. That's what I've seen. And it's the most important work to the success of these sorts of initiatives. Really quickly, I think everyone should have one of these on your table. This is, I'm going to give you the 2-minute or less crash course in what I'm doing so you can understand the context for what I'm going to share. The Pathways to Prosperity Network, I assume you all have heard of the Pathways to Prosperity report released in February 2011. This network was born out of that report where states and regions and schools and parents and businesses all read the report. It resonated deeply. The data struck a nerve. We've all seen it firsthand on the ground as practitioners. And states started knocking on Harvard's door saying, what do we do about this? Like, we know this is a problem. This has been a problem for decades. We've tried a number of things. We haven't been terribly successful. Help us think through this. So Harvard's really great at thinking and putting forth reports and being a kind of a thought leader. They're not an implementer per se, and so they reached out to partner with JFF, Jobs for the Future, which is a national nonprofit that does bridge the policy to practice continuum and also works already in the field of education to workforce, particularly supporting low-income populations to ensure that they receive the education and supports they need to be successful in careers. So JFF and Harvard had a long working relationship. I straddle both worlds and have a foot in each. And so I'm happy to be working with JFF in this initiative. States knocked on our doors. We said, okay, we'll do what we can. This is an overview of the network, so rather than having slides with all of these words, I figured I'd provide handouts. We're working currently across 9 different states, and these states are red states and blue states, big states and small states, and within each state has selected a number of regions to start implementing this work. Because as Jeff was saying, like, once again, it's great to have the idea, but how do you put good ideas into practice? Like, what does it mean to say we're going to improve career pathways so that our young people can have successful futures? Well, you got to start somewhere on the ground in real communities with real young people and real teachers and real community colleges and real businesses. So state selected regions, and then we worked with states to select target industry area focuses, depending on local labor market needs, employer engagement, a number of different factors. As we thought about this process, based on our work in Learning for Jobs is a study that OECD put out examining the vocational and technical education systems of high-performing systems in Europe. So Bob Schwartz and Nancy Hoffman, my co-conspirators in this network, are not here because they're in Switzerland, as Ron Ferguson mentioned, touring a number of our network states through the Swiss system right now. They send their fond regards. We learned that there are key implementation levers that need to take place. The first is effective state policy and state leadership. You need to have the infrastructure, but as Ron said earlier today, it's a necessary condition, but it's not enough to get the work done. So state policy infrastructure is one. Another is employer engagement. Like, we can't build effective career pathways without having our employers at the table from the beginning, and we need to assume that they're already at the table. You know, it's not just social philanthropy or social responsibility. It's also, as we call it, kind of enlightened self-interest, where employers recognize that they need to help invest in developing their future talent pipelines. So that's another implementation lever. Another one is career counseling and awareness. our young people don't get good career counseling in high school, in middle school, in elementary school, in college, simply because our guidance counselors, especially at the secondary level, have a 500 to 1 ratio. And these counselors, realistically, impossible for them to provide any sort of coherent, sustained career information and awareness to kids. So if we want our young people to practice self-determination and make decisions about what they want to do with their futures, it needs to be informed by information. So that's another lever. I'm spacing on a lever. Let me peek. No, I didn't space on a lever. The final one is intermediaries. So now we'll land in this conversation about intermediaries. We have found that there's a high degree of correlation between successful career pathways and outcomes and strong intermediaries in communities. And what's interesting is hearing Jeff talk about, this Jeff, I'm between two Jeffs, hearing this Jeff talk about the intermediaries at the state level, I want to take a minute and brag about what that looks like in Illinois. Illinois is one of our pathways states, and Jeff spoke very passionately to the development of these learning exchanges, but at the state level, these learning exchanges have 9 specific functions. And I think these functions are applicable to any sort of intermediary, whether you're on the ground or in my role as JFF, we're in many senses an intermediary between our network states. And so in Illinois in particular, and John Furr was one of the kind of masterminds behind this wonderful initiative, they provide curriculum resources. So intermediaries are helping support teaching and learning on the ground. They expand access to equipment. If you look at things like advanced manufacturing, oh my goodness, super expensive, highly technical equipment is needed to properly train our young people for careers. So how can we better ensure and leverage the equipment that's in our communities and connect the dots for schools to better connect to those? Supporting peer-to-peer networks. One of the most powerful elements of our state network for Pathways to Prosperity is the network itself. Yes, Harvard and JFF bring a lot of strengths and expertise to the table, but really the rich learning takes place from peer-to-peer. Providing work-based learning, huge. Like, as many speakers said this morning, and I heard in several of the other breakout groups, like, you can't learn workforce skills in a classroom. Like, I don't know if folks were in the previous panel here, but a gentleman was saying, you know, you wouldn't judge a violinist on how well he or she could talk about the principles of playing a violin. You need somebody to play the violin and see if they're good enough for your symphony. So too with work-based learning. Sponsoring challenges, so businesses engaging in providing young people with opportunities to demonstrate their skills and proficiencies, providing professional development to support schools, and at the post-secondary level as well, providing career development, because many of our teachers and our professors went from being a student to teaching. And that's not necessarily true for CTE. We have a lot of rich industry experience in our CTE communities, but often our teachers only know school. And I myself had no idea about the array of employment opportunities in any one of these sectors. The 3 primary sectors in our network, by the way, are healthcare, advanced manufacturing, and IT. IT is cross-cutting, of course. Healthcare, 78% of jobs in healthcare do not require a 4-year degree. I had no idea until I started digging into the data. Like, wow, there's a lot of amazing opportunity for people. Reviewing programs of study and then reviewing pipeline performance. So that's what Illinois is doing at the state level to provide these supports to the ground. What this looks like on the ground is very different in each state. And what you were saying, John, about it needing to be contextual, like that's the bird's eye view, is that each community needs to own the work of building an intermediary itself. There is no silver bullet, there's no one size fits all. Like, you gotta do the hard work of bringing stakeholders together, determining what's important to them, and who can play some of those key roles that John and Jeff have so eloquently outlined that intermediaries need to do. Like, we need someone to provide coherence and consistency and connection, because if nobody has it as their job, it doesn't get done consistently. A challenge I've seen in some communities is they say, oh, we already have this. We've got these great relationships between our high schools and our community colleges. We've got great business employment, like business engagement, school business partnerships, but it's all relationship based. It's, you know, I'm a strong teacher, my husband's brother is in some great company, you know. Those sorts of relationships may provide strong learning opportunities in the moment, but they're not sustainable and they're not systemic and they're not coherent. They're not enough to provide all young people with the opportunities that they deserve. So we need to have somebody holding the ball, somebody holding the responsibility to connect the dots, to be, as Jim was saying from the Illinois Manufacturing Association, I sat next to him earlier today, he said, intermediaries are translators and they are ambassadors. Like, they're standing between a lot of different cultures, because really the business community speaks a different language than the education community, and they're on different time frames. When business wants something done, it doesn't move at the speed of academia. And similarly, schools need to be responsive to business needs and learn from one another. So I really appreciated you bringing up that as part of the role. Another piece I want to say is that intermediaries also serve as a safe place to surface conflict and challenges that communities are facing. Like, we've got to put what we're trying to do on the table, and we have to be honest with where we are in the work and how well or how difficult, or how poorly we're doing in addressing what we want to achieve, and also serve as a provocateur to help each partner at the table be their best self. So in addition to setting the common, the planning and the convening and the brokering and the evaluation roles, they're also there to kind of poke and prod and cheer and encourage and support, but definitely be the holder of the place to surface difficult conversations. In each region, it looks differently. In Massachusetts, the workforce investment boards are leading the charge. And that's not the case in other states. But here in Massachusetts, we have a really strong WIB system. And so if you look at Boston, the Boston PIC is a tremendous intermediary. Out in western Massachusetts, in the Springfield area, we have a strong WIB. In North Carolina, I was just there last week, and a community college is playing this role. Blew my mind. I went with this community college on a tour of their employers in the region with 300 eighth graders through 6 different industry employers, and then they returned to the community college. It was amazing what this community college was doing. In Missouri, it's the K-12 system. One of the districts is holding the intermediary role. In Illinois, I'm gonna give a shout out to Aurora, which has already been done a couple times, but just as Jeff was talking about needing to have the political cover and the CEOs at the table, Aurora is doing just that. They're forming a new intermediary because they have a lot of complicated jurisdictions to navigate with 4 different school districts, different counties, different community college districts. And so they need to have a neutral ground where everybody feels safe to speak and everybody has equal ownership and participation in it. So the mayor and the Chamber of Commerce are leading that initiative. So in each community, what an intermediary is and what it does is different. Well, maybe not what it does, but how it is shaped is different. And I've talked a lot, so I can go on and on.
Great, thanks, Amy. So I've got a lot more questions, but I want to make sure that folks out here have a chance to get your questions answered. Right here.
The backbone organization or the intermediary, well, thanks. Not necessarily in the context of education, but just overall, when you do the funding for this not inexpensive effort to have a backbone there, how do you convince the potential funders of that is in fact a worthy enterprise?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was actually going to be my next question for these guys, so thanks. Well, why don't we hear from your thoughts? Jeff, I know this has come up with you a lot.
Well, I mean, what our funders saw was the opportunity through alignment to leverage. I mean, it's asset mapping, and all those 9 functions that are a part of each and every learning exchange are things that are happening right now in various partnerships in various communities with schools. I got 865 school districts. I got 50 community college districts. Somebody is doing mentoring. Somebody is doing bringing those teachers into the workplace. Somebody is doing career counseling in each of those clusters. And when you asset map and you know where the gaps are, I think it's pretty easy to sell why it's critical to fill this gap, and this is what it's going to take. And this is what you're going to see when you do it. I mean, I don't think the sell is that hard once you've got your inventory, once you know what you've got and what you don't have and what you got to have. I mean, that's been I mean, I'll find out. You know, we're constantly building this thing, and we don't have near the reach that we want to have in our state. So, but that's my sense.
Yeah. Jeff Edmondson, I know this has come up in your communities across the country quite a bit.
Yeah, we actually just put out a white paper on this exact topic because it comes out all the time. And I don't know that it's even on our website yet, but if you email Linda Brandon at Brandon, BRANDINL, at strivenetwork.org. And I'm actually really curious to see how many of you email her. So please write that down. Brandon L at strivenetwork.org, and ask her for the white paper on funding backbones. I think it could be really helpful. It talks both about how you frame this, which is what Jeff was getting to, and then also potential fundraising mechanisms to get folks to take it on. But the number one analogy that seems to be, and it's solely because of John and their work advocating on behalf of the importance of this work in a big way, is an analogy to the private sector, which is to say, in many ways, what these backbone organizations are becoming is very similar to the broker that you typically depend on when you are investing in the private sector, right? That essentially we have created such chaos in the social sector. We jokingly, and actually it's Nada Abbott here from Milwaukee, it's somebody from GE that gave us this analogy. But there's a Super Bowl commercial that we ended up uncovering from, I think it was one of the very first Super Bowl commercials, and you can find it on YouTube if you just go to Super Bowl cat herding commercial. But it's all about just pulling together all these different cats to get a, essentially a clear picture of where you're trying to go. Well, the private markets used to be the wild, wild west, right? And the whole idea of creating brokers in the stock exchange was to give equal information, good information to people consistently. And in part, what you're trying to create with an intermediary or backbone is a way to get consistent, good, and dependable information at a state, regional, or local level consistently. And that has started to resonate with folks to say, you know what, if I wanted to make better investment decisions, whether I'm in the public or the private sector, this could help. And essentially what we've been encouraging communities to do is to begin to identify funders who are interested in one of the outcomes you care about. So it could be career readiness, and if you've got a way to measure that, wonderful. Not everybody does yet, but we're getting there. It could be career placement. But if they care about that outcome, would they be willing to invest $40,000 or $50,000 as part of a backbone that may be focused on multiple outcomes to ensure that we can get the data and the basic staffing in place to play this intermediary role? And we've started to see that funders are beginning to take interest in that. It's not every funder. And quite frankly, you have to just be able to look at your local context and say who's going to be willing to look at it that way and have one-on-one conversations. But those would be some of the lessons that we've learned. But I think the white paper could be really useful if you wanted to look that up.
Yeah, I think it's
B is B-R-A-N-D-I-N, Brandon, L.
Yeah, this is still fairly, visionary funding for most funders. They typically want to fund programs. They want to look at outcomes. This is funding quote unquote infrastructure. It's funding systems change. I think some funders will get the point that, it's a $500,000 to fund a good backbone organization that, actually can help align and coordinate $7 billion worth of budgets in the area. You don't get much more leverage than that. But I think what Jeff and his colleagues, the paper that they've developed, is really good at sort of breaking it down and saying, okay, most funders are going to look at more specific outcomes than that. And what are sort of the generic or typical outcomes associated with this type of work that might appeal to certain types of funders? I thought it was a great paper they put together. Yes, in the middle there.
Hi, yes, David Moore from the National Academy Foundation. And first, thank you very much. I have a deep appreciation for the work and the struggles, having lived it myself, and I think the framework is really fantastic. So I'm going to ask some challenging questions that you can choose to answer or not answer. They're more out of a state of listening all day to a series of panels. And the first is I've heard, and thankfully here more than anywhere, this conversation about the role of data and evidence. But I think we have to ask ourselves, how can we create change leading with data and evidence when I've seen nothing today that's data or evidence except how bad the problem is? Now, I haven't been in every room. I can't be in 4 breakouts at once, but I haven't seen much of it, including here. The question I have about backbones is, are they essential or are they nice to have? And Amy, you just pivoted to, it's actually the collection of roles that are important, and they may be split up in a community, which leads me to the question of, well, which roles are most important when? And how do we know? Because if I can't build all those right away, which one should I build first? Right? And what does the evidence tell us about which role is most important when, under what conditions, in which kind of community? Right? And I guess what I want to push, if you've got responses, I'd love to hear them. But I think we've got a long way to go if we're going to take advantage of these ideas and make them practical and actionable in a resource-constrained environment that we need to shift to create change. So I appreciate you letting me make a comment, I guess, more than ask a question. But
Is that a question?
I think I'd love to hear your reactions. I think it's a question for me and for the room. And if this movement, if this idea of a pathways network is going to do something, we have to go beyond sort of the nice list of things we'd like to have and know which ones come where, when, to make the most difference.
And from our standpoint in Illinois, we wanted to do a finance exchange, but NAF and all of those great resources at the national level, we couldn't coalesce it in Illinois, so it's sitting out there. It may come together, it may not. The folks that, the manufacturers, research and development, health sciences, IT, agriculture, those guys put national and local money behind it. And they got partnerships, agriculture in 312 high school districts already. So, I mean, we're not out to bribe anybody to doing something that they ought to be doing anyway. If they want to do it, we're giving them the conduit for it. And we're not trying to invent something that we got to push uphill because we got enough of those things already.
So I'd love to talk to you offline about implementation science and all sorts of great things along those lines. But as I said, we're seeing a correlation between the two. We haven't found causality in our work yet that I can point to with any scientific rigor. But that said, like, this is what we need to tackle. Like, I totally feel you. We need to be able to demonstrate our effectiveness and our return on investment for all parties involved. And so, good comment.
Yeah, I welcome that comment. We're wrestling with this right now. So we are actually rolling out in 3 weeks what we're calling quality benchmarks for how to do this effectively. And essentially the reason we're doing that is we created initially sort of a rubric. So this, I shared a couple slides on this handout. We created what we called the framework for building cradle-to-career civic infrastructure because we were funded by a group called Living Cities to really study what was happening in Cincinnati and a few other communities long before the collective impact article even came out. And essentially this framework was our attempt to kind of boil it down. And we initially created a rubric because we thought all of this stuff had to happen pretty much at the same time. But what we've realized over time, watching it unfold in communities, is that there are some things that have to happen before others in order to make this happen effectively. There is a progress continuum, or we're calling them these quality benchmarks. So you'll see in a few weeks something we're going to blast out there called the theory of action that I think David's going to get right at your point. And the bottom slide on this, in essence, captures what we would say are the most fundamentally critical. I still think what John put out is more comprehensive and is the holy grail of where we would like to go, 100% behind it. But I think in the end, in communities, if you can have a single backbone, one thing we're worried about is there's sort of a proliferation of backbones now in communities. Everybody wants to play this cool role, and folks are calling what was collaboration collective impact and calling it a day and putting thumbs up. And what we're saying is that there are a few key roles for a single backbone around a set of outcomes. And then there's also this role of convener around individual outcomes. And they're complementary, but they are different. So all this to say, I'm totally with Amy that we're trying to figure this out right now. But I think we're closer to figuring it out, at least some of the nuggets of information, than we were before. But welcome the challenge. And we actually were funded by Casey Foundation to do a study of essentially how would we measure collective impact, right? And we worked with a firm called Child Trends to do that. And they essentially said, you need these quality benchmarks. You need these milestones to determine whether or not it is nice to have or fundamentally critical to have. And our inkling is it's fundamentally critical. But do we know yet? No.
Yeah, one thing I would add is we don't think this is new money into the system. In fact, there's a lot of wasted money in the system today. This is a process that should and does, and we have seen it, start to align funding and resources around what works. And again, when you look at a $500,000 investment in a backbone or $1 million investment in a backbone, that's aligning and coordinating $7 billion worth of budgets out there. You're darn sure that that's there's plenty of return on that investment. Being able to prove that beyond the shadow of a doubt, attribution versus contribution, we're still working on. But, and we may never get there, frankly. But this isn't new money into the system. This is a different way of doing doing business.
Well, and how do companies measure their impact right now? How does NAF measure its impact right now? I mean, it's all over the board. So we're doing the tough. We're not doing the impossible.
Question way in the back.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Earl Buford from WRTP in Milwaukee. Can you tell us how or if local funding collaboratives are connecting to the Pathways model?
Sorry, I just put a mint in my mouth. You're mintless. Hang on.
So absolutely, and the one story I didn't get to tell was about this, right? How do you get, what is the critical role that funders can play in this? So there's kind of two sides to the role funders can play in our mind. One is to take off the funding of the backbone, right? To take that off the table, because that is a unique brand of funder, as I think John said, and that's one piece of the puzzle. Funders can play a hugely important role in incenting the use of data collaboratively to drive decision making, and essentially, what I think we've assumed is that the best role that funders can play, funder collaboratives can play, is to pool a bunch of money and have everybody work to try to deserve to get some of it, right? And that's the historical pooled fund. And I don't know if anybody's ever seen this, but there's a one slider, like a Far Side type cartoon, where there's two angels up on a cloud, and one's looking down and says, gosh, everything looks great. And the other angel has a big sack of money that he's about to throw down and says, watch this, right? The idea being is that money can cause more chaos than anything else. And what we have seen is that the role that funders can actually play is not to promise a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They could say things like, in order to get our resources, we want you to be part of this network of practitioners that are working to improve third grade reading, or that are working to improve career placement, right? And that encourages the providers to actually work together, assuming the backbone can provide the capacity to use data effectively, right? Or they could say, I'm going to put aside $50,000, and when you have a collaborative action plan that demonstrates that all the partners are working together, then I would consider about how to use some of that money to fund that rather than fund $5,000 for individual organizations. Does that help? So I think the funder collaboratives can be a really powerful force in this, but it's not necessarily by pooling dollars. It's more about changing how they operate.
Well, and with that, real quick, I mean, philanthropy is a blessing and a challenge, of course, because they demonstrate wonderful things that could be, and then the funding dries up, and the next great thing comes along. And so what we're trying to do in the Pathways to Prosperity Network is, yes, blend public and private dollars together to incorporate local and regional and state and national philanthropies to be engaged in this work. And we have a number of different funders supporting it at all levels, which is great. But to ultimately build this into general operating budgets at state and local systems, because that's the only way to truly sustain it. So.
Okay. Yes, right there.
Hi, Allie Richards in the Vermont Governor's Office. I appreciate this quite a bit. We actually do a lot of this sort of work, coalition building, especially around workforce development and education, out of the Governor's Office without realizing this is what we're doing. So this is nice to see it written down like that. But a few times we found ourselves in a position where we identify a problem, and one which a collaboration would be very helpful, and then we do a quick scan and realize there are dozens of organizations in our state that already do this or say they do it, but clearly, since we didn't know about them and there's still a problem, they're not that effective. So do you just have to reinvent the wheel, or can you somehow get a new thing to bring these groups together, or can you co-opt one maybe that's doing it a little bit better and enhance what they're doing? We found ourselves in that position a few times now. So
Exactly that. I mean, the best place to start in building an intermediary is to start with existing organizations. Like, what are the building blocks that you have in your community, and look at their missions, if they're aligned with what you're hoping to accomplish. Whether or not they're being effective is another question, and you would need to have all stakeholders kind of hold peer accountability to ensure that what you're trying to accomplish is done. But start with what you've got. Absolutely.
We talk about something called the value exchange, and what we found early on when we were trying to get practitioners to work together around a given outcome is that we assumed that everybody understood the value the intermediary was playing, but never spelled it out in extremely, almost excruciating detail, right? And so what we would recommend in a situation like that, and I just want to say it's ironic that we're finding that a lot of the cat herders that end up leading these intermediaries are people that have worked as chief of staff or in roles, I'm guessing, that are similar to what you're playing because you've had to deal with this. But what we would recommend is to say, what's the outcome you want to move? To put out not an RFP, but an RFE, right? A request for engagement. And say, would you be willing to come to the table to try to move this dial if we were able to negotiate with you what are the supports you need in order for us to move the dial together? And that would be defining the value exchange. What would the intermediary do for the practitioners? And what would the practitioners be willing to commit to do in order to move the dial, right, collectively? And that value exchange is a really profound concept.
Jeff.
You know, what we did, there were a ton of manufacturing groups that were doing manufacturing training. And there were a ton of IT groups doing IT training. And we actually went to bid, and we actually said, you know, you guys better coalesce, because if you're splintered and if we get 3 or 4 or 5 different bids for this sector from each of you, we're going to go to another sector. So we basically directed that, through that process, we directed all of them to play well together and select their own lead. And so we got the IMA. I would have gone there in the first place. But if I'd have done that, that would have been the heavy hand of the Roundtable. We got CompTIA. ITA and the other IT groups in Illinois rallied around CompTIA. So, I mean, you got all these lead players. They have it absolutely core to their function, and they have to do it. But the way to win, the way we worked around that was industry, select your own big dog, and that's who we'll play with.
We'll take 1 or 2 more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. Let's see, you had a question. We'll go right behind you.
Me? Hi, I'm Erin Bebo from the State Education Agency in DC. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the professional development relationship between intermediaries and CTE faculty, and especially drill down if you've encountered challenges in that process, any sort of collective bargaining concerns. Maybe we just actually submitted a citywide CTE task force, or sorry, citywide CTE strategic plan in DC, and one of the things that we're really hoping to do is to connect the workforce with our CTE teachers, so we'd really value your input on this.
Let me, in Illinois, the state used to actually fund a teacher in the workforce kind of program, and I can't remember the acronym for it, but it was really kind of snazzy. And then when the state funding dried up, nobody did it, at least on an organized basis. I can tell you, you know, the Northrop Grummans, the Caterpillars, the ADMs, I mean, those guys are doing this all the time. They just aren't getting any publicity for it. You know, they don't want publicity for it. You know, we made that one of the 9 key things in the R&D exchange. Argonne has got the best science and math professional development in the world. And nobody, you know, they're scrambling to find teachers to take it. And through this exchange, my sense is we'll be able to make that transaction cost a lot easier. There is no money for that kind of stuff anymore from the public side, but it's so valuable. And my sense is, just ask your major companies in your service area there, and I'll bet you they're already bringing a lot of teachers out.
So
one
real
last
quick,
question. And then
let me just say one quick comment is, we don't frame this as a new initiative or an add-on, but rather a kind of strategic realignment of existing things. Common Core state standards rollout provides a tremendous opportunity to better integrate career and technical education into, like, I believe every teacher should be a CTE teacher. All teachers need to own their responsibility for college and career readiness for all of our kids. And so the heavy emphasis on application of knowledge, not just acquisition of knowledge, I think provides a real opportunity to reframe how PD takes place in schools, which I'd love to talk to you more about later.
Great, thanks, Amy. Yes, last question, then we're going to do a little bit of a wrap-up with everyone.
Thank you. Really appreciate the conversation. A lot of it's on the supply side, and I guess I understand we're a lot of providers here. our research has shown there's a lot missing on the demand side. I mean, the really granular insights from employers in terms of what they need, as well as the granular real-time interaction. I mean, the definition, I mean, Jay Notes in the conference just says, like, the definition of employer engagement is getting a letter of recommendation. So you go like once a year and ask them to say nice things, as opposed to having that weekly supplier buyer relationship that, you know, kind of reflects an exchange. So I was just wondering, what structurally do you see being put in place on the demand side?
So Cincinnati is just launched something, and don't mean to just harp on that, but this is I think an evolution of the intermediary role. Essentially, Cincinnati had the Strive partnership, which focused on the traditional pipeline, and then over time, similar partnership, the Greater Cincinnati Workforce partnership formed around the non-traditional students, right? And both groups realized that success in college was really dependent on better understanding the supply question, because there wasn't an understanding of how to motivate and how to best integrate career technical education into what's already happening rather than making it an add-on. So they just hired a person, a human being, that's going to sit at the chamber, and their sole job is going to be to really understand the supply side in a deep way. What are the needs? What are the training opportunities? What could be integrated both in the traditional education pipeline and the non-traditional education pipeline that would directly help employers and reduce their costs related to professional development when they bring on employees? And I think that's a really interesting development. It's probably one of the most profound connections we've seen. There's also a group in Fort Wayne, Northeast Indiana, that's created probably one of the most robust regional strategic plans I've seen in the country. And they have made it a priority from the beginning to make sure that business leaders are not there just to give letters of endorsement, but to actually help shape and drive the strategy so that it meets their needs. And it took them, though, having just every single meeting asking if they were doing that or not, because it's so easy to slip back into old habits and not do that, right? And just go back into professionalizing everything. So I think you have to be just really intentional about it. And in the end, we probably have to have people on board. That's really their sole job, is to understand that perspective and make sure it's infused into our strategies.
Well, so one of the things we heard was Germany has 4,000 people who do that. I mean, their entire job is to work with industry to understand what their hiring needs are. 4,000, right? And you mentioned one.
Yeah.
So,
We've got a ways to go.
I think this gets back to David's question, right? I mean, we haven't yet proven out the concept. I bet you in Germany they've seen results, right? So
unemployment rates are lowest in Europe, right?
Yeah.
Right. So we have to figure out
25% of their economy in manufacturing.
Yeah. Yeah.
There we go. You also may want to look at the Boston PIC. Neil Sullivan is their executive director here in Boston, and he uses WIA funds. Actually, I think he has 28 different funding sources, so talk about needing to juggle and braid a lot of funding. But he has workers in high schools to work with kids on career advising. He has workers specifically dedicated to different industry sectors to get to know local businesses, understand their needs, and help match students to those needs. So he has a whole cadre of people out in the field connecting, stationed physically in industry and in K-12. And we see other examples of that also reaching out into community colleges too.
Yeah, I think that we're just still really early stage in how to do that. There's some great examples. Paul Grogan from the Boston Foundation wasn't here today, but they have a great initiative called SkillWorks that has led to what's called the National Fund for Workforce Solutions. Basically, is workforce development models that are industry driven and sector specific in many respects, similar to the Illinois Learning Exchange. But I think we haven't, as a society, learned how to do that well, or even basically what the models are. So it's a great question to end on. I'm going to just ask, maybe panelists, if you could think for a moment, but I'll ask the audience. We're supposed to, as a group, come up with a call to action coming out of these workshops. And the topic here was intermediaries. So I'd like, if anybody has any thoughts on what calls to action we should bring back to the full conference tomorrow, I'll ask each of you in a minute, but I'd love to hear any thoughts that you might have. Just shout them out. Try to keep them short. Thoughts? A navigator for intermediaries. So you can figure it out. Oh, charity navigator. Okay, charity navigator for intermediaries. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Here?
I think it's important that intermediaries, whoever you choose, if it's an education entity or a business entity, it's got to be somebody who doesn't care who gets the credit. Because they're the ones that are going to keep people at the table 2, 3, 4 years down the road when life happens and people want to start drifting away. It is like herding cats, and it is translated. So whoever it is, if you're in it for the credit, don't be the intermediary.
So we say credibility versus credit is what you should be seeking. Great. Thank you. Any others? Key performance indicators for intermediaries. Great. What else? Measurable metrics. Good. Thank you. Right people with the right skill set doing this job as backbone. It's a challenging job. Fun, interesting job for the right people. Good. Champions program. Good. Did you have one up here?
I'm just learning about intermediaries for the first time, and I think what we're looking at doing, we are actually doing our own Safe Foundation. We work on the issue of poverty. We measure everything. We measure activity. We measure results, job placement, women in housing, and we engage public-private partners at all levels in terms of finding out what are their goals and their funding, showing them all the activity and all the results at the end of the day. So I don't know.
But your headline is?
The headline is, if there is not an intermediary that is achieving your goal, look at an organization that is taking action and doing it at the ground level and already has the collaborations in place to achieve your outcomes you're looking for. I've never heard of an intermediary.
Right. So look for organizations that are playing that role already. Great. Panelists, if we could have your recommendations.
Jonathan, is this on our website yet? ilpathways.com. All right, we put together, we've been doing this for four and a half years, developing this thing. And for the state and local delivery systems, we have 5 metrics, 5 principles for action. Get your goals, performance metrics, and data in place. Define your statewide leadership and governance structure. Identify your employer engagement and leadership within the prioritized sectors. Clear the pathways models and resources throughout, and then develop your regional intermediaries. Then for the student, family, and educator pathway participation, we've got personalized pathway plans, work-based learning opportunities, early post-secondary opportunities, community and parental outreach, and pathway-focused educators. So there's 10 base, we patterned this off of the data quality campaign, indicators for a good data state. You had these 10 indicators. This is kind of what we wish we'd have had when we started our piece, and this is still a work in progress. I'm sure it'll be up on the site at some point very soon.
Great. Amy?
Just that intermediaries need to be very careful and comfortable with complexity and ambiguity, and have push-pull strategies in how they engage stakeholders. You always want an open door to have as many stakeholders across your community engaged, and yet you don't want to be so flexible that you lose your shape or you lose your direction. So you also need to herd the cats or hold true to your North Star and keep your bearings. So be open and yet at the same time be consistent.
Great. Thanks, Amy.
And I would just say that in the end, it is going to come down to leadership on actually making this sustainable. And we have a colleague in one community that is really pushing for us to stop talking about intermediaries and to start referring to this as the impact sector. To say to everybody that this isn't some fuzzy bureaucratic thing. This is how you have sustained long-term collective impact. And I would say that I would think about referring it to that and then professionalizing it, right? the skill sets, we met with the Annie Casey Foundation at the beginning of the year and outlined what are the skill sets that you need in order to do this job well. Let's create a training program to make it possible. Let's actually professionalize this so that it becomes a respected part of how we achieve outcomes within the impact sector.
Great. And just to wrap up, as we professionalize this, we also need to work with both the head and the heart. So I'll leave you with my favorite Peruvian proverb, which is that the world will be changed by those with burning patience. The world will be changed by those with burning patience. So that's my wish for all of you. And if we could put our hands together for our panelists here.